Pastor Barber, what do you think about that? Do you think that uh, is there more truth to the incremental approach of the 60s versus perhaps what we're seeing today, where we're looking for some change, basically exactly what Reverend Dr. Harris is describing, where we need to keep applying tremendous amounts of pressure to make perhaps what could be described as a long overdue change happen. What are your thoughts? What strategy what do you think is more
Well,
useful? Or
yeah, well, I think what we're experiencing now is in many ways very similar to what was going on in the 60s. It's a mixed bag, okay? As we are moving toward change, as we want change in our society, it is human nature, I think, to want it quickly. I mean, most of the things that we want to make our lives better, we want it now. And just as history tells us in the 60s, it was not all camaraderie in the movement for civil rights. I mean, there were different factions that were applying pressure in different ways for change. And there was the peace without any compromise on the way the message was being presented and demanded. The demands were being asked for. And then there was the other side where it was at all costs, whether it was violence or whatever we needed to do in order to get the attention of what was then the establishment. Those were the opposing forces on the same side of the ultimate issue, right? That's not so different from what we're dealing with now, all right? There are plenty of opportunities to see the parallels between those who want incremental change now and those who were in favor of incremental change during the birth of the civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s, and so forth and so on. I do think, though, that the energy that exists in our struggle now is just as powerful as the energy and momentum of the 60s. Therefore, that similarity sets us up for moments of success like what we saw in the 60s. Without a shadow of a doubt, the civil rights movement through the 60s achieved great things, all right? But that's in hindsight in many ways, right? Those who were involved in the struggle at the moment might have said that it wasn't so much so. I don't think it will be that different now. I think right now in this struggle, and I will agree with Dr. Faith on the fact that there is very little centralized leadership within the movement or within the groups that are seeking to propel the movement in this age. That I would like to bring to attention is a detriment. The fact that there is a lack of centralized leadership that is recognized by all of those involved sets us up for the possibility that this moment in time could possibly be an event versus a movement. Movements continue when there is structure around the objectives. And when we do not have that structure or that common message that holds everybody together, that gives the opposition to the movement the opportunity to control the narrative. And so we pivot from talking about the rights of citizens and human beings. We pivot from the fact that now we have a multicultural movement that says, I want to see change, not just for myself, but I want to see it for people who don't look like me. We have a moment in time where there is a pivot by those who are trying to control the narrative to turn this into something about symbols and something about the nostalgia of holding on to monuments and so forth and so on. So we have to be very, very, very careful that we do not miss the forest for the trees. But back to your original question, do I see a pushback on incremental change? Of course. because people are tired of being sick and tired. And when we get into that place, you said something early in the introduction where you have all of these emotions that are boiling over. You don't know whether you should be angry or be sad or be, you know, it's all of those emotions that America is feeling right now. And Black America, not only are we feeling it, but it has boiled over, and now it's manifesting itself in some ways that that folks are, how can I say, where folks are just waiting for someone to take the reins and harness the energy to move it into something that will sustain itself.
Yeah, can I quickly add something to that?
Please, Imam.
I think while agreeing of the apparent lack of any centralized leadership, I think as compared to the 60s, there has been the centering of the radical voice. So the movement in the 60s, the radical voice might have been more marginal to the movement of Dr. King and others. Whereas now, the radical voice has become central. And that's the voice that we hear primarily addressing the establishment. And I think that is a major difference.
And I would just like to add that I think, you know, one of the thoughts that I had there related to which I in some ways would disagree with Pastor Barber on, that in fact, not having identified leadership in some ways has its benefits. In that what happened to the 60s, in the 60s, when leadership was able to be identified, they were also able to be targeted and killed and removed, which created chaos. And I think that the reality that there is in some ways, this is going to be a terrible metaphor, so please forgive. But the idea of, you know, some of these zombie movies, you know, that you may be able to, you know, cut off the head or just to, you know, stop this group from coming, but there's always more coming. And so I think in some ways there's potential for that to be a good thing if there's some again, some structural a narrative about and there's some agreement on the narrative. And I think that to me is the more important issue here, you know, that we have a narrative that centers on the dismantling of the roots of oppression and the roots of white supremacy in our world, not just in our country, but in our world. And I think that, you know, is a good starting place and a place where people can do this work and not be necessarily targeted and picked off by those who would want to see the silenced.
I totally agree with that. I think that is a very good point, Dr. Faith. That is the fact that the narrative needs to be clear in the conversation as we see this movement develop. I would say though that from the standpoint of the targeting of those that would be in the centralized leadership, I really believe that in the masses in the 60s that there was that feeling of if I go, there will be others that will come, and I think that is still a common thread even now, because I believe we're seeing that even in its fledgling moments with those that are in this movement. They're not really concerned about their own safety. They're not really concerned about their own well-being, if you will, from a selfish point of view. I think that they're saying, you know what, if this is what it takes for me to see change, and not just change for me, I'm impressed and I'm thrilled to see the number of parents that are involved to say, I'm willing to march because I have children. I'm willing to be there because there are generations yet to be born. And if something happens to me, others will come. But I do agree with you. I do agree with you that there must be a framing of the narrative in order for the narrative to continue to ring true. Otherwise, it's going to get muddled.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pastor Barber.